Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Fanfiction podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. Today, we're diving into a brand new story. What if Belle has the power of infinity and Six Eyes Part 3? Before we jump in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Been enough. But an idea began to form in his mind, a plan that might just give them the edge they needed. He would need time, training, and perhaps something even more dangerous, but it was their only hope. We'll train, Belle said, his voice filled with determination. We'll find a way to beat him. And I think I might have an idea. The others looked at him, curiosity in their eyes. But first, we need to get stronger, Belle continued, his eyes blazing with resolve. We need something that will kill Hades, and this time, make it permanent. The room fell silent, each of them sharing the same thought. They had faced hell itself, and they had survived. Now, they needed to do more than survive. They needed to conquer. And no matter how much it would take, they were ready to face whatever awaited them. The screams of pain and the sound of clashing weapons echoed through the training grounds as Belle's team pushed themselves to their absolute limits. The air smelled of sweat, blood, and determination. A dark, rugged terrain stretched out in front of them, artificially constructed by the gods to test their limits. Each training scenario was more dangerous than the last: fields of lava, poisonous swamps, blinding snowstorms, and jagged cliffs where a misstep meant certain death. Eyest clung to a precipice, her body shaking from exhaustion and the relentless wind that whipped around her. She had been forced to fight her way to the peak, weakened by poison, her senses dulled by a blinding mist that obscured her vision. Beside her, Belle moved with ease, guiding her to a ledge as he cut through obstacles like a man possessed. His Falna flared with divine energy, a flicker of power that felt almost beyond mortal limits. Come on, Eyest, you've got this, Belle said, his voice steady despite the harsh conditions. He reached out, helping her over the final lip of the cliff. She looked at him, her eyes filled with equal parts frustration and admiration. How are you doing? This, Belle? She asked, breathless. You make it look easy. Belle smiled at her, though there was a hardened edge to his expression. It isn't easy. He paused, the divine energy he had been tapping into flowing in waves through his body, warming his core. I've started to figure out how to borrow divine energy from my Falna. It's like drawing from a deeper well. Eyest nodded, but her expression revealed a hint of dismay. She had tried, as had the others, but none of them could harness the divine energy the way Belle did. It seemed almost unfair, but Eyest knew that Belle's talent went beyond just effort. He was becoming something more, something different. Belle continued, almost apologetic. I'm still learning. It's not something I understand fully yet, but once I do, maybe I could even reach godhood. His voice held excitement but also caution, and Eyest knew that even Belle wasn't entirely sure where his path was taking him. Meanwhile, deeper in Orario, the gods were in council, discussing a very specific and dangerous proposition. Freya's eyes gleamed dangerously as she looked across the gathering of gods and goddesses: Loki, Zeus, Hermes, Hephaestus, Demeter, and more. They were all gathered to find a solution to one problem: how to get Hades out of hell. Freya leaned forward, her lips curling into a smile. We have to bring him here. Belle can't finish him while he's in his domain. We need to lure Hades out. Loki raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. And how do you propose we do that? It's not like Hades is going to just leave his domain because we ask nicely. Zeus's eyes narrowed. We need to make him think there's something worth coming here for. Something that he desires or that could threaten him. If we create the right circumstances, perhaps Hades will leave hell of his own volition. Hermes tapped his chin thoughtfully. We could create a disturbance, a false sense of vulnerability. Make him think we have something of value, something he wants to take or protect. Freya nodded in agreement. We have to be careful. If he senses a trap, it will all be for nothing. But I think if we can convince him that his power is threatened in some way, he might act out of arrogance. As the gods conspired, Belle and his team continued their training. The exercises grew more extreme, pushing them beyond their breaking points. They fought with weights strapped to their bodies, enchanted restraints that dulled their senses. They faced beasts engineered by the gods to be as powerful as floor bosses, monsters that regenerated, poisoned, blinded, and cursed them. And through it all, Bell was learning, adapting. He could feel the divine energy flowing through him, every black flash that sparked within his body now causing a resonating surge. With each clash, his power grew. It was intoxicating. He could feel the gap between mortal and divine shrinking with each passing day. Finn stood before him, his lance held steady. You seem different, Bell. You feel more like a force of nature, he said, marveling as Bell moved effortlessly, his blade a blur of light and power. Bell gave a small grin. I have to be, Finn. If I'm going to stand a chance against Hades, I need to be more than just an adventurer. I need to be something that even a god fears. Otter, fighting alongside Eyest, noticed Bell's rapid improvement. His turning into a monster in his own right, Otter said. His respect for Bell growing as he watched the young adventurer push beyond limits that had previously seemed impossible. After what felt like an eternity, the training ended. The adventurers were scarred, bruised, and battered, but they were also stronger. They had faced pain, death, and despair, and they had grown because of it. Bell looked at his companions, each of them hardened and resolute, their eyes filled with a new fire. We've trained as hard as we can. We've become something more than we were, Bell said, his voice filled with conviction. Now, we test it. They stood at the entrance to the dungeon, the familiar darkness beckoning them to step inside. This time, there was no fear, only determination. Are you ready? Bell asked, his eyes scanning his comrades. Eyest gave a firm nod. We're. Otter tightened his grip on his axe. This time, we will not fail. With the resolve of the champions of Gaia and the strength gained from their torturous training, Bell and his group descended once more into the dungeon. Their mission was clear: fight their way to hell and face Hades again. They moved quickly, floor after floor. Every enemy, every monster that dared cross their path was struck down with ease. The air around Bell seemed to shimmer as he drew on divine energy, his blade carving effortlessly through anything in his way. The others followed, their confidence unshakable, their skills honed to deadly precision. After days of clearing the dungeon, sealing flaws, and facing waves of creatures, they reached the gate that led to hell, a dark, foreboding structure that seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. Bell looked at his comrades, a determined expression on his face. This time, we go in stronger. This time, we'll face him, and we'll show him our true strength. They stepped through, and the world shifted around them. The air grew cold, the darkness thick and oppressive as they found themselves once more in Hades' realm. But this time, something was different. Bell could feel it, the divine energy thrumming in his veins, a power that matched the oppressive weight of hell itself. He drew his blade, the edge gleaming with the promise of strength. Hades won't know what hit him, Bell said, his eyes blazing with determination. And as they moved forward, the adventurers knew that this time they were ready to face anything that hell threw at them. They had trained, they had suffered, and now they were about to prove that no god, not even Hades, could stand in their way. The adventurers moved through the familiar darkness of the 80th floor with unwavering purpose. Monsters that once would have been formidable, opponents fell in waves before their combined might. Bell's blade flashed like lightning, each strike a seamless blend of physical prowess and raw magical energy. Eyest moved alongside him, a storm of wind and steel. Otter's heavy strikes crushed anything in his path, while Finn's precision and Reveria's devastating magic cut down anything from a distance. It seemed, for a time, that they would make it all the way without encountering anything capable of slowing them. But as they rounded a corner, the air changed. There was a deep, resonating presence. A doorway of darkness opened up, and Hades stepped out. His eyes, filled with arrogance and greed, were the only things visible within the shifting shadows that surrounded him. You've come far, children of Orario, Hades said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. He wore a condescending smile. But you've wandered too far, and now you face the end. Bell narrowed his eyes, stepping forward, unfazed by the sudden arrival of the Lord of the Underworld. He had expected this. He had been hoping for this. The tension in the room was palpable as the adventurers moved into formation, their weapons raised. "This is our chance," Bell murmured to the others, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "We've prepared for this." And, with those words, the battle began. Hades unleashed a wave of dark energy that rolled across the floor like a tide of death, its malevolence palpable. The adventurers scattered, dodging or blocking the incoming attack. Bell, however, stood his ground. As the dark energy surged toward him, his magic flared up, limitless, surging power countering the darkness with effortless ease. "Now," Bell whispered, and his body seemed to shimmer, his vows that had restricted him for so long, finally breaking one by one. As the bonds shattered, a rush of power surged through him, filling every muscle, every nerve, every fiber of his being. The torturous training he had endured, pushing his body to the edge, had been for this moment. Each restriction lifted, and Bell felt his senses heighten. His 6 eyes activated, glowing with an intense blue hue. Limitless magic flooded through his veins, each particle of energy enhancing his physical attributes. His perception sharpened, seeing even the smallest fluctuation in Hades' aura. With newfound freedom, Bell's speed blurred beyond recognition, and in an instant, he closed the distance between himself and Hades. His sword flashed out, striking with impossible precision as Alfia's magic surged. Alongside his attacks, converging beams of destructive energy that tore through the divine shadows. Hades reeled back, stunned by the sheer intensity of the assault. "You dare!" Hades hissed, his face twisted in fury as he tried to retaliate. His own divine energy flared, empowering his physical form. For a moment, he seemed larger, more powerful, the dungeon quaking under his influence. But Bell was far from done. "Freya," Bell murmured under his breath, the connection between his fauna and the goddess flaring to life. Freya's divine power poured through him, a warmth that filled his entire being. It was a power that, for gods, would have taken years to grow. Bell, however, through training, devotion, and sheer willpower, managed to harness it. In a matter of weeks, as the divine energy coursed through him, Bell could feel himself changing, becoming something greater. He met Hades' glare with a look of serene confidence, as if every challenge, every trial, had led him to this very moment. With the divinity infused power at his disposal, Bell summoned Red, a technique that seemed to embody destruction itself. He focused the divine energy, channeling it to his palm as a sphere of pure erasure formed. Hades, recognizing the danger, tried to step back, but Bell moved too fast, cutting off his escape. "This is for everyone you've wronged," Bell said, his voice resolute. With a swift motion, he unleashed the red, the blast cutting through the dungeon air, striking Hades with full force. The explosion of power was blinding, the surge of energy enough to silence everything else around them. The oppressive shadow that had loomed over the adventurers dissipated, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. As the light faded, Hades' form had completely vanished, erased from existence by Bell's divine-powered red. The adventurers stood frozen for a moment, catching their breath, the realization of what had just occurred slowly washing over them. The once invincible Lord of the Underworld had been defeated, not in hell, where he was untouchable, but here, in the depths of the dungeon. And it had been Bell who had delivered the final, decisive blow. We did it," Eyest whispered, her eyes wide, disbelief evident on her face. The tension began to melt away, replaced by a deep sense of triumph. Otter exhaled heavily, planting his axe on the ground and leaning on it for support. "It's over," he confirmed, nodding. There was relief in his eyes, though he kept his composure, as always. Finn smiled, looking up at Bell, who stood amidst the dissipating shadows, his aura still blazing, eyes fixed where Hades had last stood. "We owe this victory to you, Bell." Bell finally relaxed, lowering his sword. He was exhausted, his entire body aching from the output of magic and the toll of utilizing divine energy. But he couldn't help but smile, a mix of exhaustion and triumph. They had done it, They had actually done it. They had faced Hades, in all his godly might, and they had emerged victorious. We did it together, Bell said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to face his comrades, the people who had fought beside him through every trial, every hardship. And now, we can finally leave this place. The group nodded, their eyes filled with gratitude, admiration, and respect. They had faced hell itself, stood against a god, and emerged victorious. They were battered, bruised, and exhausted beyond belief, but they had won. And as they turned to leave, there was no denying the change in each of them. They had grown, not just in strength, but in spirit. They had become something that even gods feared, champions. Forged by their trials, bonded by their victories. Bell looked at the others, a sense of unity tying them all together. Let's go home, he said softly, and with that, they began their journey back, knowing that they had faced the impossible, and they had won. Bell and the others emerged from the depths of the dungeon, their bodies weary but their spirits soaring. As they stepped onto the surface of Orario, the city erupted into cheers. Gods and adventurers alike had gathered to welcome them, their victorious return from hell itself sending waves of celebration through the city. The gods were there, Loki, Freya, and others, clapping and calling out to them. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of excitement, pride, and relief. But for Bell, the weight of what had transpired still hung heavy. The victory was theirs, yes, but at the cost of great trials and revelations that still churned in his mind. His eyes briefly met Freya's from across the crowd, and he could see the depth of her admiration and desire. He would address that soon. Enough. For now, the adventurers waved to the cheering crowd, but without indulging in the celebration too much, they quickly excused themselves. It was time to return to their familiar homes. Otter and Bell made their way to the Freya Familia manor, while the rest of their companions, Eyest, Finn, Riveria, and the others, headed to the Loki Familia manor. The night air was cool, but it carried a palpable sense of change. Inside Freya's grand manor, the atmosphere was quieter, but no less intense. The silver-eyed goddess awaited Bell in the private chambers, her aura a beacon of power and desire. Bell could feel the growing heat between them but said nothing, simply nodding to Otter before retreating into his own quarters. He needed rest, but something else stirred within him, something far more ancient and powerful. That night, as Bell lay in bed, trying to recover from the intensity of their battle, he felt a familiar pull, a tug on his very soul. His eyes snapped open, and he knew the source at once. The aura was unmistakable. Gaia. Come to me, Bell, her voice echoed inside his mind. It was not a command, but a gentle summons. He could feel her presence tugging at the edges of his consciousness, pulling him into the divine plane between waking and dreaming. Without a second thought, Bell let his awareness drift, and soon he found himself standing in a vast, primordial forest. The air was thick with life. Flowers bloomed with unnatural vibrancy, and the ground seemed to pulse with energy. Gaia, the embodiment of the earth itself, stood before him, her eyes glowing with ancient wisdom and power. You have done well, Bell Cranel, she said, her voice a blend of warmth and authority. But slaying a god is no simple feat. It comes with consequences. Bell nodded. I felt it, Gaia. I felt something change in me after Hades fell. What has happened? Gaia smiled faintly, stepping closer to him. When a god is slain by mortal hands, their divinity does not simply vanish. It transfers to the one who delivers the final blow. Her eyes glimmered as she looked at Bell. You now carry the divinities of Hades within you. Bell's heart raced. The implications were staggering. Hades' powers. Gaia nodded. Yes, you now possess dominion over the underworld, the power to judge the dead, command its creatures, and control the earth beneath your feet. These are not gifts that come lightly, Bell. They are responsibilities. Bell felt a surge of power ripple through him at her words. He could feel it now, the ancient weight of the underworld settling into his bones, the knowledge of death and judgment becoming a part of his very soul. Gaia continued, her tone softer now. You also hold powers of resurrection, though they are limited. You may control the wealth of the earth, and even possess the power of invisibility through Hades, Helm of Darkness. But remember, Bel, these powers are a part of the natural order. To disrupt the balance would be to invite disaster. Bel's mind raced with the possibilities. He had never sought power for its own sake, but now, the might of a god flowed through him. He looked up at Gaia, his heart pounding. What does this mean for me? Will I become a god? Gaia's smile grew sad. Perhaps, in time, if you fully embrace the divinities within you, you may transcend mortality. But that is a path you must choose carefully. For now, you are still yourself, still Bel Cranel. He let out a slow breath, trying to absorb the enormity of what Gaia was telling him. The power, the responsibility, it was overwhelming. But there was something else he couldn't deny, the thrill of it, the knowledge that he had grown stronger than ever before. As if sensing his thoughts, Gaia stepped closer. Do not let these powers consume you, Bel. You have always fought with honor, for the sake of others. That is what makes you strong. Hold on to that. Bel nodded, resolute. I will. As the vision faded and Bel returned to his room, he could still feel the pulse of divinity within him. Hades' powers lingered at the edge of his consciousness, waiting to be called upon. And with that power came the responsibility Gaia had warned him about. Just then, a soft knock came at his door. Bel looked up as the door opened slightly, and Freya stepped into the room. Her eyes gleamed with something primal, something hungry. I felt it, she whispered, stepping closer. I felt your ascension, Bel. Bel met her gaze, and for a moment, the tension between them was unbearable. Freya's eyes roamed over him, her desire barely contained. She had always been drawn to his potential, but now, with Hades' divinity pulsing through him, she could feel it. He was something more than mortal. You've grown so much, she purred, brushing a hand across his cheek. And yet, I still desire you. Bel felt his own pulse quicken, his senses alive with the power coursing through him. And in that moment, the tension broke. Freya closed the distance between them, her lips claiming his in a fiery, passionate kiss. That night, they were consumed by each other, Bel's newfound divinity amplifying every sensation, every touch. Freya, in turn, reveled in his power, her own divinity melding with his in a dance of overwhelming intensity. As dawn approached, Bel lay beside Freya, his body and mind both exhausted and exhilarated. He had gained the powers of a god, defeated one of the most feared beings in existence, and now he felt closer to Freya than ever before. But there was still much to consider. Hades had been defeated, but the path ahead was uncertain. The powers of the underworld were now his to command, but Bel knew that his journey was far from over. As he drifted off to sleep, Freya resting beside him, Bel couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Bel Cranel stood on the threshold of a new journey, his heart pounding with excitement and anticipation. Beside him, Freya smiled softly, her silver eyes filled with pride and desire. Loki, her fiery red hair shimmering in the light, grinned mischievously, her playful nature barely concealing the weight of the moment. The air around them hummed with divine energy as they prepared to leave the world of Orario behind, heading toward Tenkai, the realm of the gods, where time held no sway and power flowed like an endless river. Ready, Bel? Freya's voice was gentle, but there was an underlying intensity. Bel nodded, feeling the surge of his own divine essence brimming beneath the surface. After his victory over Hades and the acquisition of those dark powers along with acquiring his own divinities of heroism, worship, and having Freya's divinities pass on to him through the Falna as well, Bel had grown, no longer just a mortal adventurer but something far more. His power had grown so vast, so unrestrained, that he now stood on the precipice of something even the gods recognized, the power of a primordial. Let's go, Bel replied, his voice steady, though inside, he marveled at what lay ahead. With Freya and Loki flanking him, they began the ascent to Tenkai. Tenkai. The divine realm unfolded before Bel's eyes, a landscape so grand and ethereal that it felt like the world itself was a living, breathing entity. The sky was a soft cascade of colors, blues, purples, and golds mingling in swirling clouds that seemed to pulse with life. There was no sun, no moon, only the eternal glow of divine light that bathed everything in an otherworldly radiance. The ground beneath them shimmered like polished silver, and from the earth rose towering spires of crystal that reflected the heavens above. Fields of flowers that seemed to sing with the wind stretched for miles, and rivers of purest gold flowed through the valleys. The air was filled with the scent of ambrosia and nectar, and in the distance, the grand palaces of the gods loomed like mountain ranges, their forms majestic and awe-inspiring. Tenkai was not bound by the rules of the mortal world. The space was both infinite and intimate, filled with an overwhelming sense of serenity and power. Bell could feel it in his bones, the pulse of divine energy that resonated with his very soul. This was a place where gods were truly gods, unshackled by the limitations they accepted in the mortal world. This is where you'll be training, Bell, Loki said with a smirk, her hands on her hips. No time passes here, so we can stay as long as we need. Freya stepped forward, her gaze soft but knowing. Tenkai isn't just a place, Bell. It's a living force. It responds to the divinity of those who walk upon it. And here, without any mortal limitations, your true potential will begin to show. Bell took in the divine beauty around him, but his thoughts were focused. He could feel the weight of his power, the divine domains he had absorbed from Hades, the heroic energy he had cultivated, and the worship that fed his strength like an ever-burning flame. Freya's divinities were also becoming a part of him, and with each passing moment, he felt himself drawing closer to something far greater. Where do we begin? He asked, feeling his body hum with the possibility. Over the next days, or what felt like days, though time had no meaning here, Bell was introduced to the divine secrets of Tenkai. Freya and Loki guided him through places that no mortal had ever seen. They visited Yggdrasil, the world tree that connected the realms, its massive roots winding through Tenkai like veins of life itself. Its branches stretched beyond the heavens, each leaf shimmering with divine energy. In another part of Tenkai, they visited the Hall of the Easy, where the Norse gods gathered for council and revelry. Great halls lined with ancient runes, walls adorned with tapestries of battles fought across the realms, and golden thrones that radiated power. All of it was breathtaking, yet Bell felt himself growing more accustomed to the divine atmosphere with each passing moment. Bell's training was grueling. Freya and Loki pushed him to harness his divine energy, teaching him to control it, mold it, and channel it into something greater. He learned how to shape the earth beneath him with a thought, how to summon the power of the underworld to judge the dead, and how to command the riches and life of the earth itself. But more than that, he began to understand how the divine domains of heroism and worship intertwined with his essence, feeding him with endless power. During their stay, Loki and Freya observed how Bell's presence in Tenkai was different from any god or mortal who had ever visited. His aura had become something else, something more potent. It was as if Bell was no longer bound by the constraints of the divine order. His power grew with every act of heroism, every ounce of worship that came from the world below. Eventually, it was time for Bell to create his own divine shrine, a place that would house his power and serve as the focal point of his growing divinity. Freya and Loki watched with anticipation as Bell stood at the center of a vast, empty plain, his eyes closed, focusing on his divine energy. With a single thought, the ground beneath him trembled, the air shimmered, and the land began to reshape itself. From the earth rose towering pillars of marble, etched with intricate designs that glowed with divine power. Between the pillars, fountains of crystal-clear water sprung forth, cascading into shimmering pools that reflected the heavens. Around the shrine, beautiful flora bloomed, flowers of every color, their petals soft and radiant. At the center of it all stood a grand throne, carved from the purest stone, its surface smooth yet powerful. It exuded a sense of regal authority, as though it had been there since the dawn of creation itself. Behind the throne, a waterfall of liquid light cascaded down, filling the air with a soft, melodic hum. Freya and Loki stood in awe, their mouths slightly agape. They had seen many shrines, but nothing quite like this. It was perfect, breathtaking, even by divine standards. The power that radiated from the shrine was unlike anything they had ever felt before. Bel had not only created a shrine, he had created a masterpiece. But Bel wasn't finished. Turning to the two goddesses, he smiled softly. Without a word, he walked behind the throne, where a chamber awaited. The entrance was framed by flowering vines that glowed softly in the divine light. Inside, the chamber was lavish and seductive, pillows of the softest silk lined the floor, and the air was thick with the scent of incense. The walls were adorned with tapestries of Bel's greatest feats, and the soft light from the fountains outside illuminated the space with a warm, golden glow. The bed at the center of the room was grand, large, enough for gods, with drapes of fine fabric cascading down around it. The sheets were woven from threads of silver and gold, shimmering with every movement. It was a place fit for divine beings. Freya and Loki, still in awe, exchanged glances. Their usual confident demeanors were shaken by the sheer power and beauty of what Bel had created. Bel walked up to them, his presence overwhelming, his divine aura filling the room. He gently took their hands, leading them to the bed. The night that followed was one of passion and power. The three of them lost in each other's presence, their divine energies intertwining in ways that transcended mortal understanding. It was as if the very fabric of reality shifted around them, the lines between mortal and god blurring. When Bel awoke the next day, Freya and Loki lay beside him, their forms peaceful and content. He had grown more than he could have ever imagined. His powers, now fully controlled and refined, pulsed through him with the confidence of a true god. Freya stirred, her silver eyes gleaming as she looked at Bel, with a mixture of love and admiration. "You've surpassed even my wildest expectations," she whispered, her voice soft. Loki grinned, her eyes still filled with playful energy. "You've made a goddess out of me," she teased, though her tone carried genuine warmth. Bel smiled, his heart full. He had done it. He had come into his own as a divine being, mastering his powers, and forging something truly extraordinary. But even with his newfound strength, he knew there was still work to be done. They would return to the mortal world, but Bel would no longer be the same. With his powers now fully under control, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Whether in battle or in love, Bel Cranol was now a force to be reckoned with, both as a hero and as a god. And with Freya and Loki by his side, the future held limitless possibilities. Bel Cranol stood at the gates of Orario, flanked by his two loves, Freya and Loki. The divine aura that radiated from him was subtle yet undeniable, like the soft hum of power that vibrated through the air wherever he went. Freya gazed at him with proud adoration, while Loki flashed her mischievous grin, her eyes gleaming with excitement for what was to come. There, time in Tenkai had changed everything. Bel was no longer just a mortal adventurer, he was something far more. His powers, now fully awakened and honed, made him a force beyond anything Genkai had ever seen. With Otter, the boar-like warrior, towering beside them and the ever-stoic Finn leading the way, the group moved with purpose. Eyest, her blonde hair glowing in the daylight, stood ready with her sword, while the twins, Tiona and Tyon, bounced with eager energy, their hands gripping their weapons tightly. The rest of Freya Familia's Level 7s followed behind, their battle-hardened faces alight with anticipation. The air buzzed with excitement as they descended into the dungeon together, ready to unleash their newfound strength. The first few floors passed like a blur, barely more than an afterthought for adventurers of their caliber. With each strike, Bel could feel his body effortlessly reacting, his strength flowing through him like never before. The monsters were no match for the combined force of their group, and the adventurers relished in the thrill of battle. Bel launched himself into the fray with an exhilaration that felt new, almost intoxicating. No longer did he have to hold back or worry about controlling his power. His movements were a symphony of combat, magic, divinity, and martial prowess blending seamlessly into a fluid dance of destruction. A swipe of his hand summoned walls of fire that roared to life, swallowing hordes of monsters in their path. With a thought, he commanded the earth to rise, shattering creatures as they were crushed by his geokinesis. Each step he took resonated with divine energy, and his sword, now infused with his raw divinity, cleaved through the dungeon's abominations like a blade cutting. Through air, the deeper they went, the more Bell let loose. He darted. From monster to monster, the thrill of battle singing in his veins. A flurry of punches, a devastating kick, his martial arts training flowed seamlessly with his magic. As he moved, Bell felt his divine energy, humming beneath the surface, empowering each strike with supernatural strength. His attacks were no longer just physical or magical, they were divine. "Otter, to your left," Bell called out, his voice steady yet filled with excitement. The massive warrior grunted in acknowledgement, his great axe swinging down with brutal force. Bell watched as the ground cracked beneath Otter's feet, the sheer power behind his strike obliterating the monsters in his path. "Nice one." Tiona laughed, her twin blades flashing as she danced through a group of monsters, cutting them down with joyful ease. Eyest, always silent but deadly, moved like the wind. Her sword, imbued with wind magic, slashed through the air with precision, each swing ending a creature's life. Bell couldn't help but admire her skill, but even more, he felt the joy of fighting alongside such powerful comrades. Tion, grinning from ear to ear, punched through the armored hide of a giant beast, her knuckles crackling with the force of her impact. "We're gonna lose count of how many we've killed at this rate." "We already lost count," Finn called back, his spear piercing through several monsters at once. The blonde Paolum commander's precision was unmatched, each thrust of his spear executing the perfect strike. Bell laughed, the sound full of life. "Who cares about counting? Let's just keep going until we've had our fill." There was no need for strategy anymore, just the sheer, unadulterated joy of battle. They bulldozed through the floors, deeper and deeper into the dungeon, without a care for what lay ahead. The walls crumbled before their might. Monsters shattered into dust beneath their onslaught. Even the strongest beasts, the ones that had once been feared by the lower-level adventurers, barely lasted a moment against the combined might of Freya and Loki's familiar elites. At one point, the dungeon began to shift, its walls trembling as though the very structure of the labyrinth was recognizing the power they wielded. But they paid it no mind. Bell, in particular, was having the time of his life. He could feel his stats rising with every battle. His mind reached out to his Falna, and the numbers surged like never before. It wasn't just experience. It was divine exilia. As he fought, he could feel himself growing stronger, his stats increasing far beyond what any mortal adventurer could achieve. Freya had whispered to him once that his divinity, and the act of heroism and worship, gave him access to a limitless reservoir of power. And now, he could feel it. He was raising his stats. Himself, his strength, agility, endurance, everything, soaring far beyond anything the dungeon had ever seen. His exilia surged, maxing out at X2000, the highest rating possible, but his power didn't stop there. His level climbed and climbed until he stood at level 20, an unimaginable height. As Bell carved through a final wave of monsters, his divine aura flared. Freya, watching from the backlines, with an indulgent smile, felt the surge of power emanating from him. Loki, standing beside her, let out a low whistle. "Level 20, huh?" Loki grinned, giving Freya a sidelong glance. "I guess we weren't kidding when we said he's divine in more ways than one." Freya giggled, huh? Cheeks slightly flushed. "In the sheets, too, Loki. Let's not forget that." Loki snickered, but her eyes gleamed with pride for Bell. "Well, if anyone's gonna break the limits of this world, it's him." The deeper they ventured, the more monstrous the foes became. Huge beasts, with scales like iron, hydras with heads that regenerated almost instantly, and swarms of creatures that blotted out the dungeon's dim light. But it didn't matter. Bell and his companions tore through them, their skills sharpened by battle, their power pushed to new limits. Otter's massive axe cleaved through the heads of a hydra as Finn darted through the air, his spear stabbing into the creature's heart. Eyes. Wind magic swept through a battalion of monsters, while Tiona and Tion worked in perfect harmony, dancing through enemies with devastating force. And in the center of it all was Bell, unleashing everything he had. Fire erupted from his palms, lightning crackled along his sword, and the earth itself responded to his will. He was a force of nature, a god of battle. Each strike, each spell, was infused with his divinity, pushing the limits of what anyone thought possible. And as he fought, he could feel his power growing, his strength evolving. It wasn't long before the dungeon itself began to crack beneath their feet, unable to contain the sheer magnitude of their strength. They fought with reckless abandon, not even caring how many floors they had passed. They fought because they loved it, because this was what they had been born to do. By the time they finally came to a stop, the air was thick with the scent of battle, the ground littered with the remains of monsters. Bell, his chest heaving, looked at his companions, all of whom wore the same expression. Satisfaction. We're ally did it, didn't we? Tiona panted, wiping sweat from her brow, a huge grin on her face. Eyest sheathed her sword, her expression as calm as ever. Yes. Finn surveyed the battlefield, his spear resting on his shoulder. More than just did it. We broke through to new heights. Bell smiled, the divine energy in him settling into a calm, steady rhythm. He could feel the change in himself and his companions. They had all broken through their limits. They had reached new heights of power. Let's go home, Bell said, his voice soft but filled with contentment. We've earned it. And so, with the dungeon trembling in their wake, the group turned and began the long walk back to the surface, stronger, closer, and ready for whatever lay ahead. Bell Cranell felt the steady pulse of his divine power coursing through his veins, his senses heightened by the sheer amount of energy he was wielding. The group had been descending through the dungeon for what felt like days, but none of them showed signs of fatigue. Bell, along with Otter, Finn, Eyest, Tiona, Tyon, and the elite of Freya Familia, bulldozed through the lower floors like they were playgrounds. No monster, no beast, no floor guardian had been able to slow their advance. Their camaraderie and the thrill of battle kept them pushing deeper and deeper, beyond even the known floors. The further they went, the less they cared about their surroundings, each floor blending into the next as the powerful group tore through wave after wave of increasingly monstrous creatures. Bell barely had to think anymore. His power, both magical and divine, responded to his every instinct. A flick of his wrist could shatter the ground beneath him, sending a torrent of rock and debris into an incoming swarm of monsters. His sword, glowing with a pale ethereal light, moved faster than ever before, cleaving through anything in his path. Otter, towering as ever, fought with brute force, his immense strength sending shockwaves through the air as he demolished creatures left and right. Finn's spear danced in perfect precision, and Ari's windswept swordplay cut through monsters like butter. Tiona and Tyon moved in tandem, their laughter almost playful as they dispatched enemies with effortless grace. It was almost too easy. They had stopped counting the floors long ago. The dungeon, once considered the most dangerous place in the world, had become a mere playground for them. Bell leapt over a ravine, his divine power making his movements swift and graceful. He landed beside Finn, who was inspecting a strange rune carved into the wall of the dungeon. It was ancient, crackling with faint magical energy, but nothing that posed any threat. "We're deeper than anyone's ever been," Finn commented, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. "The dungeon should be throwing its worst at us, and yet it hasn't been much of a challenge." Bell nodded, wiping some dirt from his brow. "I've been thinking the same. We've faced floor bosses before that were harder than this. It's almost like the dungeons." He hesitated, not sure how to phrase it. "Afraid of us." Tiona, overhearing, let out a snort of laughter. "Afraid of us? We've been too good for this place for a while now." Otter grunted, agreeing with her. "This power we've gained, perhaps we have surpassed the dungeon itself." Eyest, standing quietly beside them, didn't say anything, but the sharp gleam in her eyes indicated she was on the same wavelength. Something felt off, but none of them could quite put their finger on it. They continued forward, fighting for the joy of it, exploring simply because they could. The monsters came, but they fell like leaves in a storm, and the dungeon itself seemed to quake beneath their overwhelming might. It wasn't until they reached a new, unfamiliar floor that something changed. The air around them grew thick with tension, and a faint metallic scent of blood hung in the atmosphere. The walls of the dungeon looked darker, slick with some kind of ominous fluid. Finn's keen eyes narrowed as they approached. A large cavern, the sound of hushed voices echoing from deeper within. "Be on guard," he said softly, signaling to the others. The group moved forward cautiously, their powerful presence filling the room. As they stepped into the cavern, they saw something that gave them pause. A group of adventurers, or what remained of them, lay scattered across the stone floor, their bodies battered and blooded. Most had died with expressions of fear etched onto their faces. Bell's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene, his sharp senses picking up traces of lingering magical energy, strong, dark magic that didn't belong to the dungeon. At the center of the carnage stood a group of figures cloaked in shadows. There were 4 of them, all draped in black robes with strange symbols stitched into the fabric. Their faces were obscured, but the aura they exuded was one of raw, malicious power. "Who are they?" Tyon whispered, her usually confident tone subdued. Finn's hand tightened around his spear. "I don't know, but whoever they are not ordinary adventurers." The cloaked figures hadn't noticed them yet, too focused on what appeared to be a ritual of some kind. The cavern's air grew colder, darker, as a strange purple glow began to pulse from the symbols on their robes. Their magic was thick, almost suffocating, and Bell could feel the weight of it, pressing against his own divine power. Before they could act, the figures seemed to sense their presence. Slowly, one of them turned to face the group, though their face remained hidden beneath their hood. A strange, unsettling laugh echoed through the chamber, and with a wave of their hand, a portal of swirling darkness opened at their feet. Another time, the figure said in a cold, mocking voice, "We'll meet again, gods and heroes." Without another word, the cloaked figures stepped through the portal and vanished, leaving only silence behind. Bell's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. Whoever those people were, they were powerful, dangerously so. He could sense it. And worse, they seemed completely unfazed by his and his companion's presence. The rest of the group remained on high alert, their weapons still drawn as they scanned the cavern. "What was that?" Eyest finally asked, her voice as cold as the air around them. "I don't know," Finn admitted, his brow furrowed in thought. "But whoever they are not just adventurers or some random cult. There's something bigger at play here." Bell clenched his fists, the remnants of the dark magic still lingering in the air like an uncomfortable itch. "We should head back to the surface and report this. Whatever they were doing here, it's not over." Back in Orario, the group made their way to their respective familiar manors. Bell, Freya, and Otter returned to Freya's mansion, while Finn, Eyest, and the others returned to the Loki Familia's headquarters. The mysterious encounter weighed heavily on all their minds. That night, Bell sat in one of Freya's grand chambers, his mind replaying the events of the day. He could still feel the dark presence of those figures, the way their magic had twisted the very air around them. It wasn't just their power that unnerved him, it was the way they had disappeared, without any sign of fear, even when facing gods and top-tier adventurers. Freya approached him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "You're troubled, my love." Bell looked up at her, his eyes thoughtful. "Something about those people, they were different. Strong, yes, but there was something else. I think even the gods might be wary of them." Freya's expression darkened slightly, her eyes narrowing in contemplation. "You may be right. There are forces in this world, beyond even the gods' control." Bell felt a chill run down his spine. If even the gods were wary of them, then who were these mysterious figures? And what were they planning? "We'll find out soon." "Enough," Bell said quietly, determination filling his voice. "But until then, we need to be prepared." Freya leaned in closer, her breath warm against his ear. "I have no doubt you'll rise to meet whatever challenge comes your way, Bell. After all, you're more than just a mortal hero now." Bell nodded, though his mind remained on the dark figures in the dungeon. Whoever they were no ordinary threat, and soon he would have to face them head-on. Bell Cranell stood at the edge of the wild forest, his eyes scanning the vast landscape before him. A week had passed since he had left Orario behind, seeking solitude and clarity. The thrill of adventure called to him, but something deeper, something more primal, urged him to set off alone in pursuit of those mysterious people. The days had been spent living off the land, hunting, cooking what he could find, and sleeping under the stars. His senses had sharpened, and his power, now imbued with divine energy, allowed him to thrive in the wilderness. He felt more alive out here than he ever had in the dungeon. The whisper of the wind through the trees, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of distant animals, it was peaceful, grounding. But Bell knew his purpose was more than just to find peace. He had to find them, the mysterious group of Avilders, the cloaked figures he and his companions had encountered in the dungeon. There had been whispers, hints of their presence in the deep woods, and Bell followed the trail like a predator stalking his prey. On the 7th day, Bell's search paid off. Hidden beneath a thick canopy of ancient trees and rocky outcroppings, he found what he had been looking for, a secluded lair, tucked away in the heart of the wilderness. The air around the entrance was heavy, dark, pulsing with the same malicious energy he had felt back in the dungeon. Bell approached the entrance with caution. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, and his heart pounded in anticipation. This was the place. The lair was carved into the side of a mountain, an ominous, gaping entrance leading into darkness. Bell stepped inside without hesitation, the damp stone walls of the cave absorbing the sound of his footfalls. He moved silently through the narrow corridors, his heightened senses allowing him to navigate the twists and turns. The deeper he went, the more disturbing the scene became. He passed rooms filled with strange, experimental tools, vials of dark liquid, and crude magical circles etched into the ground. In one room, there were strange cages, empty now, but they reeked of something sinister. Whoever these people were, they were conducting some twisted experiments. Bell's stomach churned. This wasn't just about gathering power. This was about something darker. At the end of a long hallway, he found the last room. It was dimly lit by flickering torches, their shadows dancing eerily along the walls. In the center of the room was a large, pentagram-shaped circle scratched into the rocky floor, runes and symbols surrounding its edges. In the middle of the pentagram, a clock symbol was etched in stark contrast to the rest of the markings, its presence radiating an unsettling energy. Bell narrowed his eyes as he studied the circle. He could sense the magic, the power it contained. Whatever this group was planning, it involved time itself, a manipulation of reality far beyond what most mortals could grasp. Suddenly, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Without a second thought, Bell pressed himself against the shadows, his body moving with the grace of a predator. The figures entered the room. 10 of them, all cloaked in the same dark robes he had seen before. Bell didn't hesitate. In a blur of movement, he struck. His divine power surged through him, amplifying his speed and strength. In the blink of an eye, 9 of the figures fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground. Before they even realized what had happened, Bell's sword cut through them with surgical precision, his eyes cold and focused. There was no time for mercy. These people had committed too many atrocities. As the last figure stood frozen in shock, Bell advanced, ready to finish the job. But the final cloaked man reacted with a desperate, panicked move. His hand slammed down onto the pentagram, activating the circle. The clock symbol in the center flared to life, and a blinding light erupted from the floor. Bell tried to move, to stop whatever was happening, but the magic was too quick. The light engulfed him, and the world around him dissolved into nothingness, though he shot off a blade-shaped blast of magic right into the guy's skull. When Bell opened his eyes, he was no longer in the lair. He found himself lying on the cold ground, the sky above him a vivid, unfamiliar shade of blue. The air was fresh, crisp, and held no trace of the magical energy he had grown accustomed to sensing in Orario. Bell stood slowly, his body tensed, his senses on high alert. The landscape before him was breathtaking. He was on the top of a mountain, its peak stretching toward the heavens. The world around him was wild, untouched by civilization. Forests stretched out endlessly below, rivers snaked through valleys, and towering cliffs framed the horizon. But something was wrong. Very wrong. Bell reached out with his divine senses, searching for the familiar presence of the gods, for the aura of divinity that always lingered in the world. There was nothing. No gods. No divine energy. It was as if the world itself was younger. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He wasn't in Orario anymore. He wasn't even in the world he knew. He had been transported through time. This is the past, Bell whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the wind. I've been sent to the past. His heart raced. This world felt different. Stronger in a way, like the very essence of the earth pulsed with raw, untamed power. It was a world before the descent of the gods, before the divine had laid claim to the realm of mortals. Bell's mind swirled with possibilities. The heroes of old, the legends he had grown up admiring, were alive in this time. He could meet them, fight alongside them, perhaps even learn from them. And if he played his cards right, perhaps he could change things. Perhaps he could save countless lives before the gods descended, before the monsters ravaged the world. He clenched his fists, excitement bubbling in his chest. He could be more than just a hero. He could be a ruler, a leader. He could unite the races, bring peace to the world long before the gods ever arrived. An empire. But then, a pang of sadness struck him. He had left everything behind. His friends, his familia, Freya, Loki, all of it, gone. He was alone now, in a time not his own. But he couldn't dwell on that. This was an opportunity, a second chance to do something extraordinary. Bell stood tall, his eyes blazing with determination. If he was here, then he would make the most of it. He would carve his name into history, not just as a hero, but as a legend. And maybe, just maybe, he could create a world where the gods and mortals could live in harmony. His journey had only just begun. Bell Cranell descended the mountain with a steady pace, his senses alive to the vibrant world around him. The dense forest was unlike any he had traversed before, lush, thick, and teeming with life. Each step he took felt like venturing deeper into the heart of an untamed world. The air was pure and sharp, carrying with it the scent of pine and wildflowers, a reminder of how young this earth still was. Bell could feel the strength of the land beneath his feet, its untapped energy thrumming like a heartbeat. He was in a time long before the gods had descended, and there was an ancient vitality here, raw and untempered. Even though his mind still reeled from the realization of time travel, his spirit was invigorated. He had left the world he knew. But this past, offered new challenges and adventures. As he pushed his way through the underbrush, his eyes caught sight of smoke rising in the distance. A settlement. His heart quickened. He had wandered the wilderness for days now, living off the land. But human contact would offer him insight, and more importantly, a sense of direction. Bell moved with ease through the thick foliage, eventually breaking through the tree line to find himself at the edge of a bustling village. The settlement was small but lively, with simple wooden buildings, carts rolling by on dirt paths, and villagers going about their daily lives. It was a world of hard work and toil, but there was a sense of unity here, of survival. Curious, Bell made his way toward the largest building at the village center. A sign hung above the door, the words carved in elegant script, the Mistresses of Fate Tavern. It was a fitting name for such an establishment in a time when the whims of fate could make or break a man. Pushing the heavy wooden door open, Bell was greeted by the warmth of firelight and the hum of conversation. The tavern was filled with men and women sharing drinks and stories, their faces weathered by hardship but lively with spirit. He approached the bar and ordered a drink, his eyes scanning the room. New face, hair. A deep voice caught his attention. Bell turned to see a tall, burly man with dark hair and a bushy beard standing beside him. His broad shoulders suggested he was no stranger to hard labor or battle. Yeah, Bell responded with a smile. Just arrived. Name's Bell. The man gave a hearty laugh and clapped Bell on the back. Bell, heh. Name's Hagen. Good to meet YA. We're don't get many newcomers in this part of the kingdom. Kingdom? Bell asked, intrigued. Hagen nodded, his grin fading slightly. The Kingdom of Ankita. It's ruled by King Waldstein, a noble man, strong as an ox and fierce in battle. The king's been recruiting men for his army, preparing for a great campaign against the monsters that plague our lands. Bel's heart raced at the mention of monsters. Ankita. This was the ancient name of what he knew as Orario. He leaned in, eager to learn more. Monsters, you say? Aye, Hagen replied, his voice dropping as if speaking about a solemn topic. They've been terrorizing the villages for years. King Wallstein's dream is to wipe them out, so his son, Prince Albert, can inherit a peaceful world. It's a noble cause, and the king's set to arrive today to see who's worthy of joining him on his crusade. The thought of fighting monsters in this world, in its ancient and raw form, stirred something within Bel. I'd love to join, he said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. There's nothing like the thrill of battle. Hagen smiled approvingly. You've got spirit, I'll give you that. Come, drink with us. We've a bit of time before the king arrives. Bel joined Hagen and his group, sharing stories and downing drinks. The tavern buzzed with the talk of the upcoming battle, of the glory that awaited those who fought in the king's army. The camaraderie was infectious, and for a moment, Bel forgot the weight of his journey. He was here, among good men and women, and for the first time in days, he felt truly at home. Hours later, the door to the tavern burst open, and a hushed silence fell over the room. The villagers stood at attention, their faces filled with awe and reverence. Bel turned, and his breath caught in his throat. King Waldstein had arrived. The king was a towering figure, his presence commanding without needing to speak a word. His armor, polished to a gleaming silver, seemed to catch the firelight and reflect it with an ethereal glow. His face was stern, but there was a quiet nobility in his gaze. Behind him stood a retinue of knights, each as imposing as the next. Men of Ankita. The king's voice boomed across the tavern. I seek warriors. Not just any, but those with hearts of steel and wills of iron. The war against the monsters is at hand, and I will have only the best by my side. One by one, the men in the tavern lined up, presenting themselves before the king. His sharp eyes appraised, each of them judging their worth in silence. Bel stood at the end of the line, calm but eager. When King Wallstein's gaze fell on Bel, something passed between them, an understanding. The king's eyes narrowed, and Bel could feel the weight of the king's judgment, not just as a warrior, but as a leader. And in that moment, the king knew this man, who called himself Bel Cranel, was far greater than any warrior he had ever encountered, even greater than himself. Step forward, the king commanded. Bel did as he was told, standing tall before the king. Their eyes met, and though no words were spoken, there was a mutual respect between them. You will come to the palace, the king said, his voice firm. And tomorrow, you will be taught the ancient ways of battle and magic. I have seen something in you, Bel Cranel, that I have seen in no other. We will fight side by side. Bel nodded, a grin forming on his lips. I look forward to it, your majesty. The king gave a curt nod, and Bel, along with a few select others, were escorted to the palace, a sprawling fortress of stone and iron. There, they were given armor forged by the finest smiths, and the next day, their training began. Over the next few months, Bel was immersed in the world of ancient warfare. The people of this time, though without Falna, were powerful in their own right. Their techniques were raw and brutal, their magic more primal and unrefined, but devastating in its force. Bel watched and learned, adjusting his own style to fit the world he now found himself in. His body grew stronger with each passing day, his muscles hardening. From the rigorous training and harsh conditions of life in Ankita, the very air seemed thicker with power, and Bel's base strength began to rise, his base stats increasing as he adapted to the brutal world around him. He could feel himself growing tougher, more resilient. Every battle, every lesson sharpened his skills and his mind. Bel relished in it all. For the first time, he was being pushed beyond his limits, and he loved every second of it. As the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, he found himself not just surviving, but thriving. His divine power slumbered beneath the surface, but it was his mortal side, his human tenacity, that drove him forward. He fought, learned, and grew stronger, all while keeping his true strength hidden from those around him. The day of battle was approaching, and Bell was ready. He would fight alongside King Waldstein and his warriors against the monsters that threatened this world. But even as the battles loomed, Bell knew there was more to this ancient land, secrets yet to be uncovered, and challenges that would push him to new heights. And he would face them all with a smile on his face and fire in his heart. Bell wandered through the stone halls of King Waldstein's palace, his thoughts still caught in the web of time. The days in Anketa had passed quickly, and Bell found himself deeply immersed in the past, a world without the divine blessings, where people fought with nothing but their raw strength, wit, and unyielding spirit. He admired it, and even more so, he respected the people who lived in these harsh conditions, facing monsters without the aid of gods. It was during one of his many walks through the palace that Bell stumbled upon a courtyard he had not yet seen. The area was enclosed by high stone walls, with banners fluttering in the gentle breeze, and in the center of it all was a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but there was a determination in his eyes as he swung a wooden sword with surprising intensity. Bell stopped to watch, his interest piqued. The boy's strikes were quick, precise, and fierce for someone his age. He moved with an energy that reminded Bell of someone familiar. For a moment, Bell just watched, smiling at the boy's effort. But as he kept observing, he began to notice the slight imperfections in the boy's form, little adjustments that could make him even stronger. The boy swung again, panting slightly, when Bell finally spoke. "Your stance is too wide." The young boy halted mid-swing and turned to face Bell. Startled, his blue eyes, filled with fire and pride, narrowed at the unexpected critique. "Who are you to say that?" the boy demanded, clutching the wooden sword tighter. He held his head high, his chin raised defiantly. "I am Prince Albert Waldstein, and I will be the greatest swordsman to ever live." Bell raised an eyebrow, suppressing a grin. "Prince Albert, hey? Well, prince or not, your footwork is sloppy, and your grip on the sword is too tight. You're going to tire yourself out before you've even begun." The boy's eyes blazed with indignation, but there was a flicker of curiosity in them as well. "I don't believe you. Show me, then." Bell shrugged. "All right, if you insist." He picked up a wooden training sword from a nearby rack, twirling it in his hand with ease. The weapon felt light, far too light for someone of his strength, but he made do. He walked over to the boy, his expression calm and confident. "Now, watch closely," Bell instructed, stepping into a basic stance. He raised the sword, holding it loosely but securely, and with a swift, fluid motion, he brought it down in a perfect arc. The force of his swing, though restrained, caused a gust of wind to ripple through the courtyard. The boy's eyes widened in awe. "See," Bell said, resetting his stance. "It's not about how hard you grip the sword, but how you control it. A strong warrior doesn't rely on brute force alone." Prince Albert's pride took a hit, but instead of backing down, he raised his chin and faced Bell with renewed determination. "Could you show me how?" Bell's smile widened. He could see it clearly. Now, this was the future Albert Waldstein, the legendary hero whose name would echo through the halls of history. He remembered reading about Albert's prowess, his indomitable will, and the tales of his monstrous strength. But here was Albert as a young boy, still rough around the edges, but full of potential. "All right," Bell said, stepping beside him. "First, adjust your stance. Feet shoulder-width apart. You want balance, but you also need flexibility to move. Good. Now, grip the sword like this, not too tight, just firm enough to guide it." Albert followed Bell's instructions, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Now, try a swing," Bell encouraged. The boy lifted the sword and brought it down. It wasn't perfect, but it was much better than before. "Not bad," Bell said. "Now, again." They spent the next hour going through the basics, stance, footwork, grip, and control. Bell corrected Albert's form with patience, showing him small adjustments that made a world of difference. Albert was a quick learner, picking up on Bell's lessons with remarkable speed. After a while, the boy stopped, breathing heavily but with a wide grin on his face. "I'm going to be the greatest warrior Albert declared again, his confidence undiminished. Belle chuckled. You might be, but not yet. Albert's eyes flashed with competitive fire. Fight me then. Let's see if you're as strong as you act. Belle blinked, slightly taken aback by the challenge. You want to fight me? Are you sure about that? The boy nodded, gripping his wooden sword tightly again. I won't hold back. Belle laughed. All right, but I won't go easy on you. They squared off in the courtyard, Albert's excitement palpable. The young prince charged at Belle with all the ferocity he could muster, his wooden sword swinging wildly. Belle, of course, dodged effortlessly, sidestepping each attack with a grin on his face. Too slow, Belle teased. Albert growled in frustration, swinging harder, faster, but it was no use. Belle was leagues ahead in terms of skill and experience. Still, he admired the boy's spirit, and, after a few exchanges, he decided to show him something more. Belle let Albert close the distance, allowing him to think he had the upper hand. Then, with a swift motion, Belle parried the boy's sword and tapped him lightly on the head with the flat of his blade. Albert stumbled back, wide-eyed. You're really strong. Belle shrugged. I told you I wouldn't hold back. The young prince's expression twisted with frustration, but then, surprisingly, it softened. Instead of throwing a tantrum or sulking, Albert smiled, a genuine, wide smile filled with admiration. That was amazing, he exclaimed. Teach me more. Belle laughed and lowered his sword. You're a tough kid, I'll give you that. All right, let's take a break. There's more to being a great warrior than just swinging a sword around. They sat down on the stone steps at the edge of the courtyard, the afternoon sun casting long shadows over the ground. Albert sat beside Belle, his energy still high, but now tempered with curiosity. You're really strong, Belle. Albert said, looking up at him. Stronger than anyone I've ever met. Even father doesn't move like you do. Belle smiled softly. I've had a lot of practice, and a lot of good teachers. Who taught you? Albert asked, his eyes wide with interest. Belle thought for a moment, images of his mentors and companions flashing through his mind. I learned from many people, over many years. Some taught me how to fight. Others taught me how to think. And there were some who didn't teach me anything with words but showed me through their actions. Albert looked down at his hands, gripping his sword. Do you think I can be as strong as you one day? Belle glanced at the boy, and he could see it, the potential, the raw power just waiting to be honed. Albert Waldstein would one day become a hero, not because of his title or birthright, but because of his indomitable spirit. You can be stronger than me, Belle said sincerely. But you have to work for it. It won't be easy, and there will be times when you want to give up. But if you keep going, keep pushing yourself, you'll get there. Albert's eyes sparkled with determination. I'll do it. I'll work hard every day. Belle chuckled. Good. I'll help you when I can, but remember, this journey is yours. You have to want it for yourself. They sat in silence for a while, the cool breeze carrying the sounds of the bustling palace. Belle found himself enjoying these moments, mentoring the young prince, talking to someone who would one day be a legendary hero. It was surreal, but it also gave him a strange sense of peace. You know, Belle began, glancing at the boy. One day, people are going to write stories about you. Songs will be sung about your battles, and you'll be remembered as one of the greatest heroes of all time. Albert looked up at him, wide-eyed. You really think so? Belle nodded. I know so. They shared a smile, and for a moment, Belle forgot that he was a man. Out of time, lost in the past. He was here now, in this world, and maybe, just maybe, he was meant to be here. As the afternoon wore on, Belle eventually stood, knowing that his time with the boy was coming to an end for now. The king was preparing his forces, and soon, Belle would be at the forefront of a campaign to rid the world of the monsters that plagued it. I have to go now, Belle said, placing a hand on Albert's shoulder. But we'll train again soon. Albert looked up at him with admiration in his eyes. Promise. Belle smiled. Promise. And with that, Belle left the courtyard, walking away with a sense of purpose. He had become more than just a warrior here. He was becoming a mentor, a guide for the future. And as he prepared to face the coming battles, he knew that he would not only fight for the present but also for the future of this world, for people like Albert who would one day carry on the fight. Bell stood in the grand hall of the palace, the echoes of marching soldiers reverberating through the stone walls as the final preparations for war were completed. King Waldstein had summoned him at dawn, and now the two stood side by side, their faces etched with the weight of the coming campaign. Both were to lead their armies against the monster threat that plagued the land. This was no skirmish, it was a war for survival, and the kingdom's fate hung in the balance. King Waldstein, his face haggard and worn from the weight of his responsibilities, turned to Bell with a solemn expression. "General Bell Cranel," the king addressed him, formally, acknowledging Bell's newly appointed title. "We are ready to march. I will lead one legion to the east, and you will take the west. We will crush these monsters and drive them back into the abyss, where they belong." Bell nodded, his heart steady as he accepted the responsibility. "I understand, Your Majesty. We'll split our forces. If either of us finds anything overwhelming, we'll send word and regroup." Waldstein grimaced, knowing that regrouping would only happen in the worst-case scenario. "May the gods watch over us," the king muttered, though Bell, aware of the world's current state, felt the ironic emptiness in those words. The soldiers lined up outside the palace, two legions ready to be divided into their respective missions. Bell's gaze swept over his forces, thousands of men strong, all armed and armored, ready to face the unknown horrors of the wilderness. Bell's heart swelled with pride as he looked at his division. They were disciplined, strong, and eager to fight, knowing they followed someone who had already earned a reputation among them as a warrior of almost mythical prowess. He turned to the king. "We'll meet again when this is over," Bell promised, clasping Waldstein's forearm. King Waldstein nodded, his resolve firm, though behind his stoic mask, Bell could see the weight of the crown pressing harder than ever before. The king had a son, Albert, who was still too young to bear such responsibilities, and this campaign was as much about securing the kingdom for him as it was about eradicating the monster menace. With a final salute, the two generals split their forces and rode off in opposite directions, Bell's legion toward the west and the king's toward the east. The western lands, where Bell's army ventured, were sprawling plains dotted with forests and the occasional village. It was a region that had seen little peace over the years, plagued by wandering monsters that emerged from hidden dens and caves. Bell led his forces with precision and discipline, making camp when necessary and scouring the land for any signs of danger. For the first few days, the Legion encountered small bands of monsters, creatures that could have easily killed a level 2 or 3 adventurer back in the Orario of Bell's time. These monsters, though deadly, were no match for Bell's well-trained army. His men fought valiantly, taking down the creatures with few casualties. Bell himself only stepped in when necessary, watching from the backlines as his men cleaved through the monsters with grit and determination. As Bell stood overseeing the battlefield, he marveled at the sheer power of mortal effort. These men had no divine blessings, no superhuman abilities, and yet they fought like lions, driven by the will to protect their families and their homeland. He admired their spirit, and in some small way, he envied them for their unshakable resolve in the face of such danger. The monster waves were relentless, but Bell's division pushed forward, cutting through the beasts like a hot knife through butter. Each victory brought them closer to their goal of cleansing the western lands of the monsters that had taken root there. But even as Bell's forces moved on with relative ease, he couldn't shake a feeling of unease that gnawed at the back of his mind. He knew something was coming, something much darker and more dangerous than what they'd faced so far. Meanwhile, to the east, King Waldstein's legion was faring far worse. The eastern lands were treacherous, filled with dense forests and rugged mountains where the monsters roamed in packs. The terrain itself was a challenge, and the monsters here were far more aggressive than those in the west. They struck with vicious cunning, and Waldstein's forces were struggling to keep up. The king himself fought at the front, wielding his sword with deadly precision, but even he was not invincible. During one particularly brutal encounter, a massive beast, a hulking ogre-like creature, had landed. A devastating blow on Waldstein, nearly shattering his leg. Though the creature was eventually slain, the damage was done. The king limped heavily now, his movements slow, and his forces were scattered and struggling to regroup. The legion's weapons were battered, and many of the soldiers had already fallen. Morale was low, and whispers of retreat had begun to spread through the ranks. But King Waldstein refused to give in. He pressed forward, pushing his men harder, determined to fulfill his duty even if it meant his own life. Still, the situation was dire, and unless something changed, the Eastern Legion would soon be overwhelmed. Back in the west, Bel's legion reached a region that would one day become the Amazonian homeland. The land here was harsher, the air thick with humidity, and the monsters that roamed these jungles were unlike anything Bel had faced in the plains. Giant beasts, towering serpents, and scaled horrors emerged from the dense foliage. They were stronger, faster, and more aggressive than the monsters Bel's army had encountered earlier. Bel, sensing the rising difficulty, decided to step in more frequently. His presence on the battlefield was a game-changer. Wherever he went, the monsters fell in droves, their savage roars silenced by the swift strikes of his blade or the overwhelming power of his magic. The men watched in awe as their general fought alongside them, a living legend in the making. His movements were fluid, his strikes precise, and his magic devastating. With each fight, Bel's reputation among the troops grew. They knew they followed someone far beyond their understanding, someone who could easily claim the title of hero. But as they pushed deeper into the jungle, Bel could feel it, a darkness lurking ahead. He could almost taste it in the air, a sense of impending doom that sent shivers down his spine. After another hard-fought victory, Bel gathered his officers around the campfire. "We're close," Bel said, his voice low. "Something big is coming. I can feel it." The officers, though seasoned, shared uneasy glances. They trusted Bel, but his words carried an ominous weight. "Do you think it's a monster, sir?" one of the lieutenants asked. Bel shook his head. "It's more than that. I don't know what exactly, but we need to be ready. Tell the men to rest tonight and stay alert. Tomorrow, we march deeper into the heart of this jungle." The officers nodded, dispersing to carry out his orders. Bel remained by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. The heat reminded him of the thrill of battle, but also of the countless lives at stake. Suddenly, a scout ran into the camp, panting heavily. "General Bel, urgent news from the east." Bel turned, his heart sinking as he saw the look of panic in the scout's eyes. "The King's Legion, they are under siege. He's been wounded. They are barely holding on." Bel's jaw tightened. He knew this was coming, but hearing it out loud sent a jolt of urgency through him. His division was too far to reach the king quickly, but he couldn't abandon his own mission either. They were caught between two dangers. "Send word back to the palace," Bel ordered. "Request reinforcements immediately." The scout nodded and sprinted off to deliver the message. Bel stood, his mind racing. His division was still strong, but the king's forces were crumbling. They couldn't afford to lose Waldstein, not now, when the fate of the kingdom was hanging in the balance. The darkness in the jungle was drawing closer, and Bel knew he couldn't turn back now. But the unease in his chest only grew stronger. Tomorrow would bring blood, death, and perhaps something far worse than any monster they had encountered so far. And Bel would be there, standing at the heart of it all. The jungle air was thick with humidity, a heavy blanket that clung to Bel's skin as he moved silently through the underbrush. The sounds of the jungle seemed to fade into a distant hum, all of Bel's senses honed on the path ahead. His soldiers had set up camp behind him, unaware of the true scale of what lay ahead. Bel didn't have the luxury of rest. He had sensed it, the approaching danger. This was no ordinary monster. The creature known as a Malavaka had been a myth among the indigenous tribes of the jungle, a giant serpent, a guardian of the waters, and a force of nature. But Bel had never been one for myths. He'd heard of it, yes, but he didn't believe in stories. Now, as the evening sun dipped beneath the horizon, Bel knew better. He came upon the river, its waters dark and foreboding. A vast lake stretched. Beyond it, its surface disturbed by an unseen force. Bel's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his senses alert to the shifting, unnatural calm of the water. Suddenly, the earth trembled beneath his feet, and the surface of the river broke apart as a massive shape emerged. The water hissed and churned, dark ripples spreading out, as a pair of golden, glowing eyes rose from the depths. A Malavaka. The serpent's body unfurled like an ancient storm cloud, coils of dark scales glinting in the dying light of the day. The creature was as long as a mountain, its size so immense it seemed to stretch into the very skies themselves. Its body was covered in armor-like scales that shimmered, reflecting the jungle's fiery reds and oranges. Its mouth, filled with jagged teeth, opened wide, releasing a haunting hiss that echoed across the jungle. Bel stood his ground. His body pulsed with power, his divine essence flowing through him like an unstoppable river. He had faced beasts beyond mortal comprehension before, but this was something different. Yet, he did not flinch. He knew what he was capable of. This serpent was powerful, yes, but it was no match for him. Amalavaka's eyes fixed on Bel, sensing his strength, and perhaps even recognizing something divine in him. It let out another hiss, its tail striking the water with such force that the entire river seemed to boil. Bel could feel the magic swirling in the air around the serpent. This was no mere beast. This was a creature of ancient power, a guardian of the waters with the ability to wield magic. As fiercely as it wielded its strength, the water surrounding it began to swirl and whip, forming into serpentine shapes, magical tendrils that lashed toward Bel like chains of fury. Without hesitation, Bel raised his hand, summoning his magic to counter the serpents. He felt the energy surge within him, flowing from his core and into the environment. The jungle itself seemed to lean in as if watching the battle unfold. Bel's power surged through him in a torrent, and the water's tendrils were shattered, vaporized by a burst of raw energy. The serpent recoiled, its golden eyes narrowing. Bel could see the intelligence behind those eyes. This creature was not just a force of nature, but a sentient being, bound by ancient laws and a guardian spirit of the land. But Bel was beyond their reach. He could feel it. With a mighty leap, Bel closed the distance between himself and Amalavaka, his blade flashing in the fading light. He struck, his sword, cleaving through the serpent's thick scales with ease. The creature's roar of pain was deafening, the force of its threshing causing the very earth to shake. Bel danced through the air, using his divine agility to avoid the serpent's retaliatory strikes, his strikes coming faster and harder with each passing second. The serpent thrashed wildly, its body crashing through the jungle with destructive force. Bel danced between the massive coils, his blade cutting into its scales with a precision that was almost surgical. Each strike weakened the beast, and Bel could feel the serpent's magic beginning to wane. It was powerful, but it was also outmatched by his divine strength and cunning. As the serpent's movements slowed, Bel saw his opportunity. He launched himself into the air once more, landing on Amalavaka's back. He pressed his blade down with all his might, plunging it into the serpent's heart. Amalavaka let out one final, deafening hiss before its massive body went limp. Its golden eyes dulled, and the waters surrounding it stilled, as if mourning the death of an ancient being. Bel stood over the fallen serpent, panting, his body covered in sweat and blood. His victory had been inevitable, but there was no joy in it. There was only the overwhelming weight of what had been lost. A guardian of the land had been slain, not by the will of man or monster, but by the cruelty of the world. And Bel knew that this was only the beginning. The return to the camp was uneventful. The soldiers were quiet, whispering in awe of their general's power, but Bel could not shake the unease that settled in his chest. Amalavaka had been slain, but the victory felt hollow. There was a sadness in the jungle air, a mournful quiet that seemed to reflect the loss of something sacred. When Bel returned to the capital, he was met with an atmosphere far darker than he had anticipated. The news had already spread. King Waldstein had succumbed to his injuries. His body had been returned to the palace, and the kingdom was in mourning. Albert, his young son, had taken up the mantle of leadership. The boy who had once swung a wooden sword in the courtyard was now king of a fractured and grieving land. Bel's heart sank. He had known the king's death was inevitable, but the loss of such a noble man still struck him deeply. He had fought alongside Waldstein, seen the man's heart, and understood the weight he carried. Now, the king was gone, and Albert was left to bear that same burden. Bell entered the throne room, the oppressive silence weighing on him as he approached the new king. Albert Waldstein stood at the throne, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. The crown that now rested upon his brow seemed too large for such a young boy, and the weight of the kingdom's fate pressed down on him like an unbearable storm. "General Bell," Albert spoke, his voice barely a whisper, as though the words themselves might shatter him. "You were the only one who stood by my father in his final moments. I need you. Not just for the kingdom, but for me. I don't know what to do. I've lost him. My father. I couldn't save him." Bell walked forward, his footsteps heavy with the weight of sympathy and understanding. He had seen this moment coming, the day when Albert would be forced to step into his father's shoes, even though he was just a boy. Bell placed a hand on Albert's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "You're not alone, Albert," Bell said quietly. "I'll help you. We'll rebuild. We'll fight for what your father wanted. You have a kingdom to protect. And I'll be there." Albert looked up at him, tears welling in his eyes. "But how do I even begin? How do I rule when my own heart feels so empty? How do I move forward without him?" Bell gave him a small, reassuring smile, one filled with a quiet determination. "You take it one step at a time. You honor your father's memory by doing what he would have done. You fight for those who can't fight for themselves. And you never give up. Remember, Albert Castofiorfe, look ahead, move forward, and you will die." The young king nodded, though his sorrow remained. But there was something in Bell's words, something that gave him just a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. And with that small spark, the beginning of something greater started to form. It wouldn't be easy, Bell knew that much. But he would be there. For Albert, for the kingdom, and for the people who needed hope in a world so filled with darkness. Bell wasn't just a warrior anymore. He was a mentor, a guide, a protector. And together, they would find a way through the darkness. Bell Cranell stood atop the palace walls, his gaze locked on the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, casting an eerie red glow over the kingdom. The once proud land of King Waldstein was now shrouded in fear, the people mourning the loss of their king and terrified of what would come next. Monsters lurked in the darkness, but more troubling were the whispers of arrogant gods, divine beings who had descended, brandishing their arcanum, threatening mortal lives, and asserting dominance over the world. King Waldstein's death weighed heavily on Bell's shoulders, not only as a loss of a friend but also as a stark reminder of the power imbalance between gods and mortals. Bell's blood burned with fury. He had traveled back in time, to a world untouched by the gods' fauna, where people had to rely on their own strength to survive. The king had fought valiantly, but Bell knew that, at some point, these divine beings would come down from their heavens with unchecked arrogance, just as they had in the stories of old. And Bell was determined to stop them. He turned to Albert, the young king standing beside him. The boy had matured greatly over the past few weeks, but the weight of the crown still hung heavy on his head. Albert was brave, but Bell could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the struggle to lead his people while still grieving his father's death. But Albert wasn't alone, not anymore. "It's time we take control of our destiny," Bell said, his voice steady and resolute. "The gods think they can descend and rule over mortals as they please, but they've forgotten one thing. Mortals have always been stronger than they realize. And now, we're going to remind them." Albert nodded, though his face was tense. "But how, Bell? How can we fight against gods? They wield powers far beyond what we can even imagine." Bell turned to face him fully, his eyes alight with determination. "By becoming stronger. By becoming more than what we are now. There were once mortals who stood against the gods and forced them to seal their arcanum, to bow before humanity's will. I've read the legends, Albert, and we're standing at the beginning of a new era, an era where mortals will rise once again." Albert's doubt faded into something stronger, hope. He could feel the conviction in Belle's words, the belief that they could, in fact, rise against those who would see them as mere playthings. Belle had a plan, and Albert trusted him completely. Belle's attention shifted to the group gathered behind them. These weren't just ordinary people, they were the future heroes of legend. Each of them had potential, greatness buried deep within them, and Belle was going to help them unearth it. Argonaut, the ambitious and bold human, had already begun to carve a name for himself as a daring and brave soul. He had the heart of a hero, even if he didn't yet know it. His impulsiveness would need to be tempered, but Belle saw the spark that could light the fires of legend. Yuri, the human warrior with unparalleled combat skills and a keen strategic mind, stood beside Argonaut, her eyes gleaming with excitement at the prospect of battle. She would become a tactical genius, a warrior whose mind and blade worked in perfect harmony. Galmus, the dwarf, was built like a mountain and had the endurance of one too. His sheer physical strength and resilience would make him a cornerstone of their forces, a shield to protect the others when the time came. Elmina, the elf, was noble and proud, a skilled fighter with a deep sense of justice. Belle could see in her the makings of a leader, someone who would inspire others to stand and fight for what was right. Finn, the prum, small but quick-witted, had a sharp mind for battle and an even sharper sense of justice. Though small in stature, his heart and courage were immense, and Belle knew he would soon stand tall among his comrades. Fianna, the human knight, was known for her duty and courage, never backing down from a fight. She reminded Belle of the heroes he had once read about in his own time, those who had fought and bled for the sake of their people. And finally, Epimetheus, the human who had surpassed even the strongest of his time, a legend in the making. Belle saw the potential in him, the strength, the raw power, and the drive to become the greatest. He would one day stand shoulder to shoulder with the gods, but for now, he was still young and eager to learn. Belle looked at them all, his heart swelling with pride. These were the future heroes of this world, and he was going to help them reach their full potential. "We're going on a training trip," Belle announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the group. "This isn't just about fighting monsters anymore. We're preparing for something far bigger. The gods are starting to descend, and some of them think they can rule this world. We're going to prove them wrong." The group exchanged glances, the seriousness of Belle's words settling in. They had all heard of the gods, beings of immense power who could crush entire armies with a flick of their wrist. But Belle's confidence was infectious. If anyone could lead them to victory against the divine, it was him. Their journey led them to an area thick with magic, where the air itself hummed with energy. The forest they now entered was ancient and alive, the trees whispering secrets of times long past. It was said that deep within these woods lay the entrance to a den of spirits, beings of immense power and knowledge who had existed long before the gods had ever descended to earth. It was here that Belle intended to push them to their limits, to unlock the hidden potential within each of them. As they trained, the forest seemed to watch, and soon enough, the spirits made their presence known. Wisps of light flickered through the trees, and the air grew thick with magic. The group found themselves face to face with beings of pure energy, spirits from the very heart of the world. Among them, a particular spirit caught Belle's eye. She moved with grace and elegance, her very presence commanding awe. A wind spirit, known to Belle as Aria, the spirit who would one day be tied to Eyest. Wallenstein, one of the greatest heroines he had ever known. For weeks, they trained. Under Belle's guidance and with the spirit's help, the group pushed themselves beyond their limits. Their muscles ached, their bodies were bruised, but their hearts burned with a desire for greatness. Belle led by example, showing them not only how to fight, but how to think, how to adapt, and how to trust in each other. His divine nature allowed him to grasp magic and combat on a level they had never seen, and in turn, they began to follow suit. Each of them grew stronger, faster, smarter. Argonaut's recklessness became tempered by Yuri's strategic mind. Elmina's sense of justice sharpened as she sparred with Fianna. Galmus and Finn formed an unlikely partnership, their differences in size and strength creating a unique bond. And Epimetheus, Bell could already see that he was destined for greatness, surpassing even the gods themselves in time. When the training was finally complete, they stood before Bell as different people. They weren't just warriors anymore, they were heroes in the making, each with the potential to change the world. And now, the time had come to face their greatest challenge yet. The time for the crusade had arrived. The gods who had descended and wielded their arcanum as a threat would soon learn what it meant to face mortals who had risen to greatness. Bell's group of heroes was ready to fight, and Bell himself was more than eager to bring the battle to the divine. "We'll fight for justice," Bell declared, his eyes blazing with determination. "We'll fight for those who can't. The gods have had their way for too long, and it's time they are reminded of what mortals are truly capable of." The group nodded, their hearts steeled for the coming battles. They had trained hard, and now they were ready to take on the gods themselves. As they set out on their journey to confront the arrogant gods, Bell couldn't help but smile to himself. He had always loved a good fight, and something told him that this battle against the divine would be one to remember for all time. Bell Cranel stood at the forefront of his group, the wind stirring the trees around them as they approached a clearing that pulsed with divine energy. Before him stood the 12 Olympians, shining with arrogance, along with the leaders of other pantheons, the gods of Hinduism, Norse deities, and a handful of others who had descended upon this world. Bell had already felt the oppressive nature of their presence for days. Their unchecked power spread fear and chaos among the mortals, and the gods reveled in it, believing themselves untouchable. They ruled as tyrants, treating mortals as playthings, their arcanum bending the laws of the world. Bell had come to end this arrogance once and for all. Behind him stood the future heroes of legend, Argonaut, Yuri, Galmus, Elmina, Finn, Fiona, and Epimetheus, each of them wide-eyed at the sight of the gods before them. These were the beings of legend, worshipped by countless people, and yet, here they stood, completely unfazed by the destruction they'd wrought on the world. Bell, however, had no fear. He had faced far worse in the dungeon and had grown into something more than human. His divinity flowed within him, even if it wasn't fully awakened yet. And today, he would prove that mortals could stand against gods. "Are you the one they call Bell Cranel?" Zeus asked, his voice booming across the clearing. His eyes, sharp and piercing, bore into Bell with the confidence of a being who had never known fear. "I am," Bell replied, simply, his eyes narrowing. "And you're the gods who've forgotten what it means to respect the world you created. You've come down here and trampled over mortals, using your divine powers like it's your playground." Zeus chuckled, his lips curling into a smirk. "Respect. Mortals exist to serve us. We are their creators, their rulers. We need no lesson in humility from the likes of you." The other gods laughed, their auras glowing with radiant divinity. Shiva from the Hindu pantheon stood with his arms crossed, watching Bell with mild amusement, while Odin, all-father of the Norse gods, looked on with a calculating gaze. Bell's fists clenched, his blood boiling. He had hoped to resolve this without violence, but their arrogance was unbearable. "So, you're not willing to leave peacefully?" Bell asked, his tone dangerously calm. "Leave." Az, the god of war, stepped forward, his muscular form brimming with divine energy. "We're here to stay. We'll do as we please, mortal. What could you possibly do to us?" Bell's eyes hardened. "I was hoping to avoid this, but if you leave me no choice, I'll have to make you remember what mortals are capable of." The gods laughed again, their voices ringing out through the clearing. But as Bell's aura began to shift, the laughter died down. The earth beneath his feet trembled as he released a portion of his true power. His once gentle presence now radiated with the raw force of divinity and untapped potential, something that even the gods hadn't expected. "Enough talk," Bell muttered, his voice low but filled with power. "Let's settle this." Bell blurred into motion, faster than any of the gods could follow. One moment he stood before them, and in the next, he was in front of Az, his fist driving into the war god's chest with such force that the impact reverberated through the heavens. Az gasped, the wind knocked out of him as he was sent crashing into a nearby mountain, the earth splitting beneath him. "What the?" Az groaned, struggling to push himself up. Blood trickled from his mouth, and for the first time in his existence, he tasted pain, real pain. Bell didn't stop. His body flickered again, and, suddenly, he was in the air, facing Zeus. The king of the gods had no time to react as Bell's palm glowed with radiant power. Starfall strike. Bell shouted, launching a beam of condensed light straight into Zeus' chest. Zeus roared as the blast hit him, sending him hurtling through the sky like a comet. He smashed into the ground, his divine body cracking the earth beneath him. The gods around them watched in stunned silence. Bell's speed, his strength, it was beyond anything they had anticipated. Even the gods who had fought in the most ancient of wars had never faced an opponent like him. Impossible. He's just a mortal. Hermes muttered, his eyes wide in disbelief. No. Odin corrected, his one eye narrowing. He's more than that. His power, it feels like a god's, but there's something else, something even stronger. Bell landed gracefully on the ground, his gaze sweeping over the gods. You've had your fun, he said, his voice cold. Now it's my turn. A flicker of lightning appeared at Bell's fingertips, and before anyone could react, he extended his hand, releasing a torrent of electricity that arced toward the gathered gods. Tempest's wrath. The bolt split the sky, and Thor stepped forward, raising his hammer, Mjolnir, to block it. But as the lightning collided with the hammer, Thor's eyes widened. This wasn't ordinary lightning, it was infused with Bel's divine essence, far more powerful than anything he had faced before. Thor grunted, his arms shaking as he struggled to deflect the blow. But Bel was relentless, pouring more and more energy into the attack until the lightning exploded, sending Thor crashing to the ground, his once mighty weapon smoking in his hands. Enough of this, Shiva shouted, stepping forward. His three eyes gleamed with fury as he raised his hand, summoning the power of destruction itself. You've overstepped your bounds, mortal. Shiva unleashed a wave of black energy, a force so potent that it twisted the very fabric of reality. But Bel didn't flinch. Instead, he brought his hands together, channeling his own energy. Crimson Nova. Asp here. A fiery red energy erupted from Bel's hands, colliding with Shiva's attack. The two forces clashed in the center of the battlefield, causing the earth to shudder and the sky to crack. The heroes in the making, watching from the sidelines, could barely comprehend the scale of the next part is on its way. So unless you want to be that one person who hears about it last, like and subscribe now to stay ahead of the game. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. It's about to get epic. Thanks for listening. Catch you in the next chapter.